Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery for another episode of Monk Chat. So we're here tonight with the Vasa crew, Vasa 2022. So to my right, we have Ayasoma. To my left, we have Bhante Jayasara, and my name is Bhante Sudaso. And we'll see there's already some questions and comments. That's great. So as usual, we'll be taking any questions related to Buddhism. So please type in your questions and we'll answer them as they're received. And when the flow of questions stops, then the live stream will stop. So if you want us to keep going, then keep putting in questions. And we can start by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So hello so far to Rick, Rainbow, Geeta, Jeff, Yankee, Karen, Kumu, Manny, Ja, and Usha. Welcome to Monk Chat. And Rick has a question to start with. So Rick says, I have been trying to understand what drives me to occasionally lose control and buy too much, despite typically living a frugal life. Can you share some thoughts on this part of the path? And then he offers a quote from someone. I have no idea who Leo Babata is, but apparently Leo Babata said, most of our stuff we buy because of one feeling, the feeling of uncertainty. This is the underlying groundlessness, shakiness, insecurity we feel about the future and the present moment. It's the uncertainty we feel all day long, every day to varying degrees. It's what causes us to feel fear, stress, anxiety, worry, even anger. It's what causes us to procrastinate and put off our healthy and productive habits. Uncertainty brings with it an urge to get certainty, control, preparedness, security. And so we buy stuff to try to get that feeling. So I think Rick might be going for the question and answer. So I don't know who Leo Babata is, but that's actually not bad. That quote's not bad at all. But anyway, coming back to this question, would one of you like to talk about the problem of buying too much? Aya?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, simply, what drives you to occasionally lose control and buy too much is because it feels good to shop and to obtain whatever is the object of one's desire for that moment. It's as simple as that. If there wasn't gratification in the world, well, we wouldn't be that crazy to to get all tangled up in the world. So that's actually what the Buddha invites us to see, to understand. It's not that we pretend that samsara is horrible, nasty place, and it's just a big pile of feces. We actually understand that we also like the taste of feces. Otherwise we wouldn't. Otherwise we wouldn't just smear it all over ourselves. So we need to understand what it is that it's gratifying in our experience. So we understand the gratification, we see it fully, and we then also see the danger of our experience. We also see how it's impermanent, so that satisfaction of getting whatever it is, the object of one's obsession, the object of one's desire. We see how it's impermanent and also impermanent and unsatisfying. Because once we obtain it, then we're like, okay, what's next? So I really want that flat screen TV. Okay, great, I got it. What's next? Oh, okay. Then it has to come with matching remote control. I don't know. Never actually purchased a TV in my life, so I don't know how that works. But yeah, like then we're like, okay, maybe I need a phone actually, and then I need the latest phone model, and then the latest of the latest phone model, and then everything is obsolete immediately, and there's a new camera, and there's this and there's that. And how much do we actually get satisfaction in these material things? Well, it's very short-lived, but there is still that satisfaction. So we need to both see the satisfaction and how impermanent and unsatisfying it is. It's both satisfying and unsatisfying. And then understand how we deal normally with suffering. We always do exactly the same thing. Go back to searching to release our suffering in the same way that we've done before, which has proven to be unsuccessful multiple times. And we just kind of do the same thing over and over and over and over again. So we understand experientially the truth that the Buddha is talking about of how essentially put in motion this cycle of suffering and trying to get some release from suffering, and it doesn't work. And then we're like, okay, how about instead I try what the Buddha is telling me to do, which is to let go of the desire to begin with. So we train ourselves. And the first time it's going to be a little bit dukkha because you are both not getting the object that you want and not getting the sort of satisfaction of relinquishment. But then you start building up a new habit. You're kind of like, it's kind of great that I don't have this, new model of phone. Actually, this crappy phone that I have, actually, it's even better than the new model because I know how to use it. I've noticed actually that the newest models, whenever like some people share it with me, I'm like, I don't know how to use it. It's very complicated, counterintuitive, and it's very difficult. There's new functions that make it less smart. It makes it more dumb phone. But instead, actually, the older models are a lot more smart because you just, press play. It's much more intuitive. Less is more. So we were like, oh, that's actually much better that I have that I didn't do the downgrade of upgrading. And so you get some sukha immediately. But most importantly, you get the sukha of understanding actually the teachings of the Buddha experientially. And then it's not stressful. It's not a practice anymore to let go. It just becomes second nature. And then ultimately first nature.
And Jeff asks, which jobs in the military are right livelihood? Who can Buddhism help the suicide epidemic among returned and serving veterans? Can the Buddhist practice help the stresses of service life? Bhante J, what do you think?
So in general, I would say if you're a Buddhist, I would say to try to avoid any kind of military service. But in general, as long as you're not doing anything like directly killing, like maybe if you're a support role or things like that. Now, some people will say, that's still supporting killing, just like some people will say, even if you're not vegetarian, you're still supporting the killing of animals and things like that. So different people will have different perspectives on it. But in general, I would say that any kind of right livelihood would be not harming beings, right? Which is not, you think in the military, that might be hard, but actually I think like 80% or 90% of the jobs in the military are not direct combat roles. Like, there's like cooks, there's janitors, there's all kinds of different things like that. So, but we find many times people who are in the military come to Buddhism. And so then now they're kind of in their tour, they're in their years, and they want to try to, well, how can I be the best Buddhist, right? And then that's a bit of a different story. They try to do your best to, follow the precepts and live as virtuous as possible, right? And as non-harming as possible. Now, for a more on a easier note for me, I actually have I have family members and lots of friends who are veterans. Afghan, Iraq, all these kind of, people who have served many times actually. And what I found is this is a population that is growing quite well in meditation and Buddhism. Right? These are, again, I've never served. I'm not a veteran myself. It just so happens that I have lots around me that I've gotten to know. And, they, even before I was a monk, when I was a lay person, when I knew most of them, they would ask me questions about meditation and things like that. And I think that two things. I think that one, in addition to, therapeutic services, trauma-based services, things like that, meditation in the Buddhist path can be very helpful to somebody dealing with trauma. And two, actually, I find that the positive aspects of being trained in the military, like the discipline, determination, consistency, etc., like that, can actually make somebody have a good basis as a start of a meditation practice. Right. So this is a very good, when other people might be like, somebody who's trained goes, okay, no, we're going to do it. We're going to practice. Right. So I think that there's, somebody who's a veteran has probably had, experienced a lot of suffering. So that's a good, not a good thing, but that's something that can help somebody really understand the Dhamma and see dukkha, right? When they've seen like some of the worst stuff in the world. And B, that they can, the good qualities they learned can help them develop their practice. So yes.
Great. And Magyarhal asks, do you suggest spreading breath energy for jhana? Well, to be honest, I'm not really sure what you mean by breath energy. So I know what breath is. It's that air which flows in and out of your lungs. But I don't know what breath energy is. I also don't know what you mean by spreading. Because as far as I know, when you breathe, the breathing naturally spreads through your body. So you don't need to deliberately do any kind of spreading. It's kind of happening by itself.
Bhante, the only thing I would say is that Thanissaro teaches this from Ajahn Lee, this kind of like moving the breath energy through the body. Maybe this is what they're talking about.
To be honest,
something like that.
To be honest, I read Tanissaro's breath meditation instructions years ago, and I understood about 0.1% of it.
Yeah.
Like it just didn't make any sense to me.
No, it's kind of wacky.
I've known some people who, for some people, his instructions make sense and they actually get benefit from them. But to me, I didn't understand a word of it.
Different karmic conditions.
I tried it.
Yeah, and so do I suggest spreading breath energy for jhana? No, I don't. So one of the really critical qualities of jhana is stillness of body and stillness of mind. So optimally, you don't want to be deliberately moving the mind around. You want your mind to be in a state of complete stillness. So anytime you're deliberately manipulating breath energy or anything like that, then your mind is far from concentration. You're far from jhana. You might be developing mindfulness, which is good. Mindfulness is something which will later on help in the development of samadhi. But as long as you're moving the mind in any way, then you're not approaching jhana. So I recommend stillness as an entry point to jhana. That said, if you are talking about Tanissaro's meditation instructions, then I'm definitely not the person to ask. I don't understand his method, and I definitely don't use it. But I know other monks who have had benefit from his instructions. And Anjan says, close human connections are known to help in healing when people are in distress. From a Dhamma standpoint, what exactly is in play here that is helping in healing? Ayasoma.
Well, I would say that also close human connections are known to help in distressing when people are actually doing okay. So there's lots of different sort of scenarios that can happen. It's not necessarily the just having a connection, but rather the quality of the connection that we're having. So when we're talking about anatta, usually it's translated as non-self. That doesn't mean that basically there is nothing there, but rather what it means is that everything that we call self is dependently arisen. So this dependently arisen self is once again the product of causes and conditions. And one of these causes and conditions are also the human connections or lack thereof that we have in our lives. So essentially, if we want to, for example, really have great conditions for awakening, we want to have close human connections that are all essentially sharing the same goal. Much easier. That's why we put ourselves in monasteries. We all practice together the same vows and so forth. If, for example, I catapulted myself in Brooklyn right now with my friends from my previous life within this life, the circumstances, the close human connections that I would have would definitely be more directed towards going out in the bar and having fun and pursuing different career ambitions within the city, right? So it will be a little bit different than the goal for awakening. So there's a lot of different conditions that come into being that can influence our mental states. So it's not, for example, that in my previous life within this life, my friends were making me unhappy or they were making me happy, but rather we were all contributing in influencing each other in making certain choices that for me were leading towards suffering rather than happiness. So it's the same for people that are healing. If they have some sort of suffering and they want to heal from that suffering, well, then having particular human connections that surround them then will help them in that process. And vice versa, even loving people, but that are not capable of understanding how to help that person could actually put them down, So there's actually, my mom is currently visiting here in at Empty Cloud Monastery, and it's her first experience with Buddhism, and she's considering converting. And not because actually I gave her a Dhamma talk or Bhante also gave her many Dhamma talks, but it was actually not the Dhamma talks, not the teachings, necessarily the formal teachings, but rather the incredible human connections that she has made that were all rooted on these teachings. So here in the monastery. And, after COVID, she has experienced a lot of suffering, and she still is experiencing a degree of suffering. And all these close human connections that she's finding here are helping her in the path towards cessation of suffering, actually, right here, right now. And she sees the value. She sees how it's different, for example, in a monastery environment than in other types of environments that she has been all her life. She's almost 80 years old. So it's been a while that she's been around, and she's seen very different environments. And this one is very wholesome, very, very, very beautiful. So yeah, we see that her mental state then is dependently arisen from these conditions that are different from before.
And Tina says, I would like to know how to get rid of attachment. Bhante J.
Practice the Noble Eightfold Path.
Okay. Andrew asks, Bhante S., I have read that you practice both Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. Can you explain what this looks like? To be perfectly honest, the line between Theravada and Mahayana is much blurrier than is commonly believed. And usually the more advanced one's practice is, the less significant that line becomes. In my own case, I mostly use the external forms of Theravada. It's the forms which I received my basic monastic training in, so it's very close to my heart. I also primarily use the Pali Suttas as my main guide for understanding the Dhamma. But I'm also heavily influenced by the Mahayana examinations of emptiness. So although emptiness is a concept that's also in Theravada Buddhism, it's expounded upon in great detail and depth in the Mahayana traditions. And I've always found that really helpful in my own practice. I'm also deeply inspired by the Bodhisattvas. So a few of them in particular, of course, Avalokiteshvara, so Guanyin Bodhisattva. Also Kishtagarbha, Ditsang Bodhisattva, or Jizo Bodhisattva. Also I find really inspiring. Manjushri Bodhisattva, and some of the others, but those are the three really main ones that for me give a lot of inspiration in my practice. Also the Bodhisattva vows are something that really gives me a lot of motivation and drive in my practice. And one of the meditation methods that I commonly use is, in the Pali tradition, it's called animitta samadhi, so objectless concentration. But the clearest and most detailed instructions on how to actually do that, I've found, are all in the Mahayana. So particularly in the Chan schools of Buddhism. That's usually where you get the most clear and detailed instructions on that meditation method. So briefly speaking, but also, I guess, Soma, you've also had pretty substantial Mahayana influence. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think you covered it all, Bante, actually. Okay. Since we also practice in the same space, I'm very much influenced. Getting back to the question before, right? We all influence one another, and I've been, well, Bhante Sudaso has been one of my first teachers, so obviously I'm influenced by his practice.
Okay, and Rainbow says, in the spirit of Halloween, what is the foulness of the body, which I have heard from the Buddha stories leads some monks to become disturbed? Also, how to balance this with modern body image issues. Well, first off, the Buddha doesn't speak about foulness of the body. Rather, the Buddha speaks about Asuba of the body, so non-beauty. So normally we relate to things in terms of beauty and ugliness, but that's actually not accurate. Things are inherently neutral. Beauty and ugliness are value judgments which we project onto our experiences. So the body is not inherently foul, and it's also not inherently beautiful. The body is just a body, that's all. So if one is cultivating the perspective foulness of the body, yeah, of course that's going to lead you to become disturbed. It's also not Buddhist. So the body is not foul. It's also not attractive. It's just a lump of bloody meat that somehow manages to move around and eat things and defecate and all that. But it's not beautiful and it's not foul. It's just a part of nature. So that's actually what the practice of Asuba is meant to do. It's meant to break this tendency to relate to bodies in terms of beauty and ugliness, and instead to relate to bodies just exactly as what they are. So not to be disgusted by bodies, but also not to be enamored with bodies. So, but many people, when they practice Asuba meditation, they're actually using it as a way of generating hatred, aversion, and disgust towards bodies. And that is a misunderstanding of this practice. So Asuba meditation is not a way to increase your hatred of bodies. That's not its purpose at all. So that's just a way of generating unwholesome mind states, which is not something the Buddha would ever teach. So rather, the practice of Asuba is meant to generate equanimity, a calm, cool, wise equanimity towards bodies. So as for modern body image issues, honestly, I have no idea what modern body image issues are. What are modern body image issues?
Well,
depends.
There's lots, but definitely then it can affect very much the psychology of how one is relating to one's body. But usually I would say that from my experience, quote unquote, modern body image issues are a little bit different than what we're talking about in Asuba meditation. So body image issues usually are, well, there's something problematic with my body in comparison to a particular body or type of body that is proclaimed as supreme and superior in a particular culture, in a particular sort of group of people or media or country or whatever it is that whatever is our surrounding, because it can be very different. You know, for example, the body that was celebrated when I was growing up in Italy was radically different than the body that was celebrated when I moved to New York City, for example. I was like, oh, how very interesting. There's different body standards that are somewhat highlighted, at least when I moved to New York back in the day. Now I'm getting older. I don't know what is the current trendy body type. But for example, the body, how was it described? The issue, personally, I remember growing up in Italy having some issues with the body image, and they kind of almost entirely disappeared when I moved to the US because it was not a big deal anymore. It was like, oh, actually, it's like quite great. I like being here. There's not that much of an influence or an input, or it should be in this particular way rather than this other. So it's different in the way that actually the awareness of the non-beautiful of the body, of the unattractiveness of the body, is something that we want to develop for every single body. So we want to see we don't want to categorize bodies that this is beautiful and this is not beautiful, but rather understand that the body, as Bhante was saying, is the way it is. And it has some really terrible, not beautiful aspects. And it has some really great aspects too. It's just that usually we only see the great, beautiful aspects of everyone else. And we are actually partially sort of aware of of the bad traits of the unpleasant traits of our body, but to a certain degree, because actually usually when we are talking about body image issues, we're usually going, oh, well, my hips are in this particular way, or like my buttocks are in this particular way, but we're not really like thinking, for example, about the mucus that is coming out, or the interiors of our body or other bodies, or actually, even the sweat, the amount of sweat that we're constantly emanating from the body. Right now, I'm experiencing some sweat, when I see the body. But prior to Buddhist practice, I wouldn't notice it unless it was August, right? And it was like a clear, tangible experience. So when we start seeing the body in all of its aspects, so the quote unquote beautiful and the non-beautiful, then we become more aware of what we're actually talking about when the body is the body. And then we're like, okay, chunk of meat, chunk of meat, chunk of meat, chunk of meat, chunk of meat. And who cares? Not terribly different than the cat chunk of meat, or the pig chunk of meat, or the cow chunk of meat. Like it's just chunk of meat.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to add just one thing, since we've all had a whole treatise on this topic. This is one of my favorite topics. And so in Satipatthana, under the parts of the body, the Pali there is patikula manasikara. So manasikara means to consider, to contemplate, to investigate. Patikula, one of the interesting ways you can translate this word is to consider the opposite, right? So in the sutta, delicate, the Buddha talks about when he was still in the lay life, when he had his 3 mansions and, he was living the delicate life. That's why it's called delicate. And he reflects and he says, I have an intoxication with youth, an intoxication with health, an intoxication with life, right? So the Buddha is saying, well, we have an intoxication, right? We have an intoxication with the body, our body, other people's bodies. And so when you're contemplating liver, spleen, this, and this, you're contemplating the opposite. So it's like you have one extreme and you're trying to balance it out like scales. Right? That's what the practice is. It's to consider the opposite. You're already off to one extreme, bring it to the middle. You don't want to go to the other extreme, because that's when monks are, killing themselves and things like that. Bring it to the middle. That's the point, as Bhante and I have already mentioned. But yeah, Patikula Manasikara.
And Talmud says, I'm aware that monastics aren't permitted to listen to music, both because of the monastic precepts against entertainment and to preserve your samadhi. If you're out somewhere, such as for alms round or tudong, and there's music playing, how do you protect your samadhi while you're in that environment? Well, first off, by maintaining mindfulness of the body. So this is something which is really, really helpful as a general all-around practice. So constantly practicing mindfulness of the body, being clearly aware of your own body at all times, something that really helps to protect your mind. And when one hears music, well, one thing is actually to notice the habitual reaction of the mind. Does the mind react with interest? Like, oh, that's nice, I want to hear that more clearly, or I want to get closer to that. Or does the mind react with irritation, like, oh, what is that annoying noise? Or does the mind start silently singing along with the lyrics? Or like, what does the mind do? And noticing that whether it's desire or aversion, it generates a corresponding discomfort. So noticing how when the mind starts to get enamored with some music that's playing, then that disrupts the peacefulness and happiness of the mind. And again, coming back to the body, constantly returning to the feeling of your feet against the ground, feeling of your muscles extending and contracting, feeling of your lungs expanding and deflating. So constantly coming back to the sensations of your body really works wonders in those situations. Okay. And Manny asks, I am planning 2 hours of meditation and listening to some Dhamma talks tomorrow, but worried that I may get distracted by watching unrelated YouTube videos. How do I stay on course?
Well, when you don't have self-control, you can download self-control. There's this beautiful app that is called Selfcontrol that gets to, you can essentially control your activity online ahead of time. You program it, and then it's irreversible. So you just have to suck it up. Whatever you decided for it to be allowed to see, you can see it. Whatever you're set it as not allowed for a period of time. So forever, even if you're with the computer or whatever, you can't use it. So it's one of my favorite apps, actually. And what I would suggest is that you can download those YouTube videos of the Dharma talks that you want to watch ahead of time. And then set self-control and just watch those and do your meditation, and that's it. And then you just don't have access to it. No distractions. Choice is not happiness. So you just remove it. This is an influence to be transcended by avoidance, I would say. And then once you get the hang of it, you get the taste of like, oh, this is so great. I'm not spending all this time introducing nonsense. Then you will have much more strength to actually deliberately. So your self-control will be there without the self-control app.
And Jay Lyles says, I've heard that only human beings are allowed in the Sangha. Why are Nagas not allowed to ordain? Well, I assume you're referring to the particular story in the Vinaya where a Naga shape-shifted into the form of a human and then entered the Sangha by pretending to be human. And when the Buddha found out, he actually told that Naga, he said, actually he commended the Naga for its dedication, but he said that this style of training is not suitable for a Naga. So the style of training is designed for humans. And he said that the Naga wouldn't get much benefit from trying to live as a human monk. So what he told the Naga to do was instead to follow the 5 precepts and to practice the Uposatha days. So the Buddha didn't go into detail onto why, but he did say that the style of monastic life that bhikkhus and bhikkhunis live is not suitable for Nagas. It doesn't help them make progress on the path.
Could you imagine, like, if it was just known, like, yeah, Nagas, Yakas, whatever, anybody, come be a monk, and then like the monastics are like, is my fellow monastic a human, or is there a Naga, or
I actually think that'd be great.
No, well, I mean, I don't know about the people at the time. Maybe the people at the time wouldn't like that their monks could be who knows what. I don't know.
Let's say that sometimes it's difficult to live with people of different nationalities, so let alone if they're different species. So yeah. I would say
no, it
gets complicated.
I also would think it would be cool if we had a dragon as a fellow monastic.
That's be cool. Because you currently don't have a dragon as a fellow monastic. You might change your mind if you did. Be careful what dragons. You wish for, Bante.
It was set down by the Buddha.
Then if it gets angry, then you'll, miss those times when it was only like the Italian who would get a little bit irritated.
So, moving on. Rick says, can you share your reflections on the benefits and possible drawbacks of having access to multiple Buddhist lineages in America? I've had great benefit from over 40 years of Zen practice. My practice has grown substantially the last 9 years since focusing on Theravada Buddhism with a healthy balance of Zen. In contrast, having access to multiple lineages has generated a type of confusion or doubt as I've tried to find my way. So, thoughts on this? Ayasoma, would you like to say some words on this?
Sure. That it's both of the things that you mentioned are actually very true. And I've definitely noticed that in many practitioners, both the sort of, actually 3 things I've noticed. 1, getting confused. Some practitioners do in fact get confused if they're exposed to different traditions all at the same time. Some others instead actually their practice gets nourished and nourished. So that was my experience. I love actually being exposed to different traditions. Some others will pick one tradition and then be inspired by one. Have one basic, kind of like your experience. I think you were mentioning Theravada as a basis, and then having a healthy influence of Zen that informs your Theravada practice and so forth. Anyway, it really depends on our karmic conditions. So I would definitely say that it's good to start with something first and really delve deeply into it. And then from there, explore the other lineages if one feels inclined to understand a little bit, few different flavors of the Dhamma. But if that creates confusion, then it's just best to stick to one particular form, to one particular flavor. In the end, we should always assess our practice by ourselves by doing, looking at our mind and seeing, are defilements increasing or decreasing? And if they're increasing, well, we should change, we should shift. And if they are decreasing, then we keep on doing whatever we're doing. So it's as simple as that. So personally, I mean, obviously, Bhante Sudhasu and I started a non-sectarian organization, Buddhist. So we have invited Buddhist monastics from all different lineages. So clearly, both of our practices, I think I can speak also for you, have been nourished by having access to so many different monastics. But for some other people, it can be different. So I wouldn't say that one is superior to the other. It's just one is superior to the other according to the practitioner that is there, according to their karmic conditions.
And Rainbow says, when it comes to violence, there is the legend of Angulimala. Buddhism has many legends, like Christianity. Does it matter if these types of stories are true, or is the wisdom of these stories beyond that? Bhante J, what do you think?
Well, I wouldn't call Angulimala a legend. I mean, he is in the suttas. some people might say, oh, all the suttas are legends. I don't know. That's their thing. Does it matter if these types of stories are true, or is the wisdom of these stories beyond that? I think it depends on the person. Yeah, there is wisdom in the stories, even if somebody doesn't believe it's true. There's definitely wisdom in there. But understanding that, that these were people who existed in a certain time and place and followed the path, adds a whole other level. Like if you're just like, oh, I want to follow this Buddhist path, but everybody else before me was just made up. Well, then who am I following? What's my role model? What am I doing? Why am I bothering with this? Right? As opposed to, you can look in the suttas and you can see all these different people, men and women, in the ancient times, who followed the path of the Buddha, the Buddhist teaching. So, I mean, if you didn't think they were true, I mean, you could get some value, like you say, some wisdom, but it's not really going to help you down the path, and it's kind of doesn't help with the right view either. So yeah, I guess I don't know what else to say about that.
And Kumu says, what is the best translation for the title of the Bhadekaratta Sutta? I was studying it this week. She says, yay, on the 130s now of Majjhima Nikaya. Great, making good progress. So Bhadekaratta is a compound of 3 words: Baddha, which means lucky or fortunate or auspicious; Eka, which means one; and Ratta, which can have at least 2 very different meanings, which is where the main divergence in translation comes from. So one translation is that Ratta is a form of the word Ratti, which means night. The other is that Ratta means attachment, something that one likes a lot, or is very has a lot of desire for. So Bhadekaratta, most commonly you'll see it translated as something like one fortunate night or one auspicious night. But there's a handful of translators who say it means a lucky attachment or a fortunate attachment. And actually both camps make very good arguments for why their translation is valid, both linguistically and also in terms of the contents of the sutta. Briefly, the sutta is talking about somebody who is practicing mindfulness and insight 24/7. And the Buddha says someone who's practicing mindfulness and insight all day and all night can be said to be having a Bhadekaratta. So if you translate that as one fortunate night, then it makes sense. They're like, oh yeah, they're spending their days and nights well, in a lucky way, a good way. But you can also say, oh, this person's really attached to Buddhist practice. And that's one kind of attachment which is very auspicious and lucky and fortunate. So in that case, you could say it's a fortunate attachment, an auspicious kind of attachment. So I don't personally have an opinion. I think that one of the delightful things about learning Pali is that you get to learn about all these delicious little double meanings in the suttas. And when it's not totally clear, like when you have a range of different perfectly valid translations, it's actually, to me, that's joyful. It's delightful to know the different shades of meaning to what the Buddha was saying. Scott says, is there any guidance in the canon to understand responsibility?
Okay, I guess. Well, what comes to mind is actually, the encouragement of the Buddha to us monastics, so to be the heirs of his Dhamma, not of his material wealth. So a lot of times, actually, ordination can be described as a privilege, and I'm actually very uncomfortable with that word. My understanding of it is actually it's more a responsibility. So it's not a privilege. We don't take this form in order to receive praise, honor, gain, etc. Actually, quite the opposite. We should like try to avoid it as the plague in order to make progress in the path. But for different historical reasons, and obviously it being a tradition that is 2,500 years old, people can have so much faith because they've seen throughout history how this path, this spiritual tradition creates the conditions for all these incredible sentient beings to arise. And so people have so much faith, so much incredible good heart, so they can really support the Sangha in so many beautiful ways materially. And sometimes then unawakened monastics can feel like it's a very privileged sort of state of condition, and then start pursuing the path that I call of entitlement instead of enlightenment. And it's very important instead to remember what the Buddha in fact tells us, that we're actually eating alms food, like accruing a lot of debt whenever we're eating the alms food of devotees, of dedicated practitioners, of faithful people. We're actually eating it out of debt. And the only way that we can relinquish that debt, forget about student loans. It's much easier to get rid of student loans in the United States of America these days, where it's very easy to rack up the debt, but they say that it's difficult to repay it back, but much more difficult to repay it as monastics. So I'd say that is definitely a responsibility that the Buddha gives us, gives the Sangha to reflect upon. And in terms of lay people, to the responsibility to support the Sangha, to create all those different incredible wholesome mind states, the responsibility to treat their loved ones, their family members in a way that is in accordance with the Dhamma. So essentially the responsibility to practice the Noble Eightfold Path. We all have that responsibility for ourselves, for the benefit of ourselves and the benefit of others. So these are some thoughts on responsibility. I don't know if the other venerables have anything else.
Yeah, the Buddha says in, is it Dhammapada? I don't remember. The Buddha says that there's one line where the Buddha says, there are two kinds of fools. One person takes on a responsibility that is not theirs, and the other person does not take on a responsibility that is theirs. Right? So that's a very wise balance, right? A lot of people like to take on a lot more responsibility for things that's not theirs. And also, as Aya said, in the 5 subjects of remembrance, to always remember that we're the owner of our actions, so we're responsible for our actions. So yeah.
Okay. And Rainbow says, in Tibetan Buddhism, depictions of deities can often be frightening. Same for Christian gargoyles. In modern times, Batman uses fear to fight evil. Is using some dark imagery useful to combat evil?
I'm not sure. I never thought about this, actually. People here, we have some deities, actually Tibetan Buddhist deities, that those representations were donated to the monastery, and they're by the dorms. And I remember this lady got really freaked out actually when she saw it. So I'm not sure if it's useful to combat evil or fear. Maybe it's subjective. Definitely it seems to work for a big Buddhist population like the Tibetans. I don't know if it really exports that automatically. Like, I wasn't afraid ever of those images. I actually kind of didn't think one way or the other. But I don't know.
It's also symbolic. So some of the Tibetan Buddhist depictions of bodhisattvas they look actually quite demonic. But that representation is symbolic. These beings are manifestations of perfect, infinite compassion. And one of the aspects of compassion is harmlessness. So they're depicted in this kind of scary, violent-looking way as a symbolic representation of something else. So a very simple example of this is Manjushri is commonly depicted holding a sword. Well, I mean, as monks, we're actually not allowed to own weapons. So what's the sword all about? Swords are things that you use to kill people. So why is Manjushri holding a sword? Well, the sword represents a sharp wisdom that cuts off defilements. So it's symbolic. It's not meant to be taken literally. You normally don't see monks running around with swords. But you do see us practicing what the Buddha called the sword of wisdom. This is in the suttas. The Buddha actually occasionally used violent imagery in using metaphors to describe Buddhist practice. So he talks about the sword of wisdom, which cuts off defilement. So this was presented literally in depictions of Manjushri Bodhisattva. But it needs to be understood there's a metaphorical meaning here. So I think it's if you're really interested, then you can look up the symbolic meaning of the different aspects of Tibetan Buddhist depictions of bodhisattvas. There's every single detail there has some symbolism to it. And J. Lyle says, is there danger in the instruction to smile without a reason? What did Jay? Is it dangerous?
I don't know. I've never heard of this. This is definitely not a Buddhist thing. I don't think it's dangerous. No, especially if you're kind of like, I remember like in my late teens, early 20s, like when I wanted to like, you know, change and like be more like a happy kind of look on the bright side kind of person, I started to force myself to smile. And after a while, the smile actually was natural, right? So, you know, I mean, sometimes, you know, maybe it's good to smile. It has nothing to do with Buddhism or Buddhist practice, but yeah, I don't see any danger in it per se. No.
Yeah, smiling tends to make you a little bit happier, a little bit more relaxed. So I think it's fine to smile. Yeah. The only real downside is that other people might think you're a bit of a psycho. But that's their problem. It's not yours. Shadow of Label asks, do monks get physical exercise?
Depends. Really?
Okay.
Yes, it does.
Every monk is individual. Some
Yes.
exercise and some don't.
If you live in a forest monastery, you're more likely to have to do some kind of exercise, like chopping wood and lugging wood and doing, you know, these kind of things. So
if you live in a monastery, but if you live actually by yourself in the forest or with another monk, it really depends.
Yeah, and sometimes people have very long and physically challenging alms rounds that they do. When I first visited Pacific Hermitage, which is a monastery in the Northwest, which does alms round every day. When I first visited there, their alms round was 4 hours. Just walking to and from the town was a total of 4 hours. And it was up and down an extremely steep hill. So it was very physically challenging. The monks there were in very good condition, partly because of doing that alms round every day. So it often it just depends upon your circumstances that you're in. And Jay Kala says, do you have advice for using Asuba or Dhatu practice for samadhi? It's one of the most common approaches in the suttas. I'm not sure I agree with that statement, but is rarely approached from the context of samadhi. Well, honestly, I don't think that Asuba is particularly suitable to samadhi practice, and I don't think that's its main purpose either. As we mentioned earlier, its main purpose is to correct the misperception that we have related to bodies, to help us develop a calm, cool, accurate understanding of what a body is. What tends to lead to samadhi is cultivating stillness, and you can use focusing on body sensation as a way to cultivate stillness of mind. But in terms of Asuba practice, I actually don't think Asuba practice is particularly relevant to samadhi. It's a samatha practice in the sense that it helps to calm down the mind, but I wouldn't consider it a samadhi practice. As for the elements, so any of the first 4 elements can be a basis for samadhi practice if you use it that way. And actually, I know many people who either teach or use the first 4 elements as samadhi practices. Personally, I tend to prefer using it as an insight practice. I use it for anatta sanya, but it's also perfectly usable as a samadhi practice. Yeah, basically you just focus on feeling that element and focus the mind on the experience of that element and let the mind come into stillness and sharpness through focus on that element. And in that way, it's a samadhi practice. It's actually very similar to using body sensation. It's just a more specific kind of sensation that one is focusing on. And J. Lyles asks, how can one fortify the mind against unskillful influences?
Know them very deeply, very well. Know them inside out, like the back of your hand. So then once they arise, you don't allow them to influence you. You avoid or you apply different techniques that are more skillful. Right? This is unskillful influences that arise in the mind, even external unskillful influences. You're powerless unless you know them very well. You have to know them very well. So, when something happens and you do something, it's like, okay, well, let me analyze the unskillful influences and my choices that led me to this experience. Once you know them, then you have some ability to do something about them. So know them very well. You can't fortify against something if you don't know what the attack is, right? It's like, I'm going to come at you with a sword. So now I'm going to put some armor, metal armor on or something like that, right? So you need to know the attack before you can fortify and defend against it.
And I just want to add that it's very useful to actually study very well the Sabbasava Sutta to understand that also the way to counteract all these influences. Actually, influences is my favorite translation for asavas. And yeah, sometimes we just think, okay, well, I'm going to endure this all, or I am going to avoid this all, and or I'm just going to use all of this, or whatever it is. But instead, we need to understand what is the appropriate response given the circumstances. And in the Sabbasava Sutta, the Buddha is very clear that there's not one size fits all, but there are, for example, certain circumstances that we just need to avoid altogether in order to transcend unskillful influences. Some others instead that we transcend by enduring, some others that we transcend by investigating, and so forth. So by seeing and so forth. So we have to really understand what we're dealing with, as Bhante was saying, and then apply the appropriate response.
And Jaykala has a comment. I read your translation of the Therigatha and really enjoyed it. Sadhu. It's very inspiring to read the Theris where their lions were in front of the Buddha.
Great. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
And Sud asks, does the Buddha ever describe a point along the path where papancha ends? Is it at the first stage of enlightenment, the second stage, the third, the fourth, etc.? I actually don't know of anywhere in the suttas where the Buddha ties it to a specific stage. But if I had to guess, I would say it's only at full awakening that papancha actually is fully conquered. I see nods from my fellow venerables. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, because the full eradication of great hatred and delusion is only with full awakening. So it's a lot of papancha there that comes from greed, hatred, and delusion.
Okay. And Rick says, I've been practicing celibacy since 2007. And celibacy, yeah, great. And celibacy has been extremely beneficial. I have been spiritually uplifted, contented, and at peace. Good. However, recently, impulses in the mind have been clinging to fantasies of being in a romantic relationship. These strong cravings last only a few seconds or minutes, And it quickly becomes clear that what I really want is to live a celibate life focused on practicing the path of liberation. Do you know what might be causing these cravings to arise and what I need to do to become free of them?
I see you, Mara. Yeah. I mean, the answer is always just to practice the Noble Eightfold Path to be free from them. But yeah, it's there's different ways depending on each one of them on how we can counteract these influences. What has worked for me in the past is actually contemplating, my past relationships and the honeymoon. And the honeymoon is over. Repeat, repeat, repeat. So the process is always the same. And it just seems so unique while you're in it. And then, in hindsight, you can also see like, oh, I remember how it started. And then I remember how it ended. And then I remember how I went and I went like, oh, this is going to be very different this time around. And then this is going to be different this time around, and it wasn't. And then this is going to be different this time around, and it wasn't. So yeah, it's kind of like the shopping question that you were asking before. It's the same exact thing. Or like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that if I buy this spoon, all my problems will like disappear right here, right now. It's the only thing in the world I want is this spoon. And then we're like, yeah, no, actually, I also want the knife. Well, I'm sure if I get the knife, everything will disappear. Repeat, repeat, repeat. So I know it's sad to think that humans and spoons, like, we have the same relationship, but we just kind of fall into the same thing, the same pattern. It's always like that. And Mara knows that. So it's like, gets created and they're like, but the spoons in America much better than the one in Italy, I'm sure. go there.
Okay. And Manal asks, I would like to understand better why there would be waves of both profound peace and later profound sadness, and why both of these might be experienced as a lay practitioner. As I continue to investigate this, it is noticed that there are bouts of boredom at the root, unable to connect boredom and sadness. Would you offer any insights, please? Waves of profound peace and profound sadness, and boredom at the root. Well, I mean, if you think boredom is at the root, then you should address the boredom. So what normally is the cause for boredom? It's when we're not taking an interest in the present moment. So take an interest in the present moment. And you'll discover that the present moment is always interesting. Examine your experience of body-mind in the present moment, and you'll discover it is extraordinarily fascinating. And even if you feel boredom, well, then examine the feeling of boredom. What does boredom actually feel like? What is this? View it from an objective third-person perspective, and you'll be like, oh, how fascinating. What a interesting sensation. And as you become interested in boredom, then the mind is no longer caught by boredom. When you feel peace, well, pay attention to what peace feels like. When you feel sadness, pay attention to what sadness feels like. So whatever is flowing through the mind, pay attention to it without either trying to hold on to it or trying to push it away. Just watch as it flows through the mind with an objective, unattached, peaceful awareness. And as for why these things happen, well, there's lots of different reasons why they can happen. But the more interesting question is, how can I cultivate peace and joy in the midst of these sorts of experiences? That's a much more interesting question. Richard says, I felt a gradual lightness only in my upper body, and it felt as if it was ascending somewhat during my meditation on the breath, followed by a peaceful and calm state. Is there anything to note here? What did Jay?
You had an experience, let it go, and keep following the breath.
Yep. Karen says, I read that only humans can become Buddhas. What happens if or when our species becomes extinct? Would this destroy the possibility of awakening for countless beings? Ayasoma.
Well, we think always in terms of YOLO, you only live once. So humans, you only live once. Or the Big Bang, also only lived once. Nope. Big Bang, without discoverable beginning. Humans come into being and disappear without discoverable beginning. So yeah, that's essentially karma and rebirth. We think that this is all unique and happens only once, but it's constantly like this. We come into being, this new world system comes into being, then the Dhamma is discovered again, and then the Dhamma disappears. Then, it's just Buddha comes into being, then a Buddha disappears. It's always a cycle.
I'd like to know, is there anywhere in the suttas where it says only humans can become Buddhas? I don't think that's like...
Actually, I don't recall seeing that.
No, I don't know where that's from. Yeah.
No, and actually in the Mahayana, they say it's possible for any being to attain awakening. What is said is that humans are where it's the most likely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think Sammasambuddha, it comes in the form of a human being, no? I can't think of like a textual thing. But
I'm sure there's some kind of like alien Buddha on the other side of the universe.
No, I've just classified those as humans.
Yeah, that would be the human realm, basically. Yes.
Yeah, so like aliens on other planets would still be classified as humans in a Buddhist sense.
Okay,
though biologically we wouldn't call them humans.
Mm-hmm.
In Buddhism, we would call them manusaloka.
Mm-hmm.
But point being, I mean, if the human realm is the sort of quote unquote best realm in order to attain awakening,
then this is where the Sammasambuddhas are going to be, naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I've never encountered any record of any non-human being being a Sammasambuddha. They're always in the form of human beings.
Yeah, also because Brahmas would still have delusion. Like it's just very complicated.
Yeah. And Jay Kala asks, do the Bodhisattva vows and or bodhicitta practice discourage awakening in this life, or is it non-exclusionary? I don't know what non-exclusionary means. But I do remember many years ago asking a similar question to a certain senior bhikshuni from the Chan tradition. I remember she gave me this really weird look, and she was like, of course we want to attain awakening in this life, and the Bodhisattva vows are to help that. And I remember I was like, oh, of course. That makes so much more sense. Why did I think otherwise?
Of course, it will depend from the practitioner, though, Bante, because some monastics will have a different answer. But it's true, there are many Mahayana monastics from very incredible lineages that actually describe precisely that as the Bodhisattva vow and bodhicitta practice as a means to an end. So the end is enlightenment, and that's not necessarily in future lifetimes. It can be in this lifetime. Otherwise, there would be essentially no ever enlightened Mahayana monastic in the history of Buddhism. That's a little bit hard to fathom.
Yeah, there actually were a number of Chan masters throughout Mahayana history who were considered arhants, and nobody thought that was a bad thing. They were all really happy to have had such wonderful arhants in the lineage. And Jekala, referring back to the Bhadekaratta Sutta, he says, Venerable Nyanananda, I assume you mean Katukurunde Nyanananda, translates it as ideal solitude. Yeah, that's one possible translation of Bhadekaratta.
I like ideal solitude.
Yeah, it's quite nice. Yeah. And Jeff asks, which websites are good for walking you through the grammar of the Pali and the suttas, like pointing out which case, tense, etc. the words are in their relationship to other words? As far as I know, I don't know of a website which does this, unless somebody else does. But I know of some books that do this.
There's actually the new dictionary, Golden Dictionary.
Yeah,
Do
Golden
you remember?
Dict. Yeah.
It does this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, Okay.
That's why it's replaced digital polyreader for me, because it's like way more powerful in terms of like breaking down all the like the root and the things like that. It's really good.
Yeah, it's really good.
I still haven't tried it. There's your answer. Andrew Dobbs says, I find myself getting a little too complicated with my anapanasati practice in pursuit of samadhi. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, get simple. Pick a point in your body, focus your mind there. Don't move it. There's your samadhi. Samadhi practice is actually dead simple. It's not complicated. And if you try to make it complicated, then you won't get strong samadhi. So keep it simple. That's my thoughts. Yes?
Kiss. Keep it simple,
What?
stupid.
Oh.
No.
I thought you were saying that kissing was the solution to samadhi, and I'm like, wait, what? Do I know you? Who is this from?
So that's what I remind myself often. Like if I get lost in like the complications, I say, no, kiss. Keep it simple, stupid. You know, keep it simple. Go back to the breath. Like when I get complicated, I just go back to the breath. I just go back to the simple. You know.
Yep. Okay, Rainbow says, technology has many benefits, like how we are now watching you from far away. But there are also dangers that come with it, mass disinformation, cyberbullying, etc. What is Buddhism's take on this? Asuba.
Technology is just part of samsara, which pretty much has precisely the same description that you said. Yeah, there's some good things and some less incredible things. It's just, yeah, you can't separate. We always want the good. We don't question too much why we're getting all these great things. But we always question the bad things. We're like, oh, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Because Venerable Rubina Corten in one of her talks that I heard several years ago, remember her saying, inviting us to reflect on how, we always go, like, for example, to the therapist to ask the therapist why, this has happened to me, and like, oh, this like incredible suffering, I need to understand where it has come from. But we never go to the therapist going like, why did I get this promotion? Why did I get this like incredible relationship? Why do my parents love me? No, we actually take that for granted. Like the basic, like, we deserve that. But as soon as there's something that we don't like, oh dear, why is that happening? Well, it's just equally, kind of arbitrary in a way. Like it's just that one we like and the other one we dislike. And so one we're like, yeah, give me more of that. And the other one we're like, oh, absolutely, hell no. So unfortunately, that's our condition in samsara. There's both some worldly dukkha and worldly sukha. So that's no different. The internet, it's worldly dukkha and worldly sukha. And so we just need to, train our mind in order to take advantage of this instrument of the internet for a good, wholesome thing, and try to avoid the unwholesome. No different than when you're hanging out in the streets. There are people who are going to sell you drugs and some others who are going to sell you vegetables. You can either purchase the vegetables, or you can either purchase the drugs, or you can purchase both. So it's up to you. That's your karma.
And Jay Kala says, one of the epithets for nibbana is papancha. Thank you. Yeah.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. I really like that. Papancha.
Yeah.
That's a perfect monk name.
Papancha.
Yeah.
It's also kind of cute sounding.
Yes.
Yeah. Papancha.
Who will be the next Papancha?
Well, you have to get somebody who it really fits them, though.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Let's see, a lot of comments, but I'm looking for the next question.
Maybe.
Is this actually a question?
I don't think so.
Okay. Let's see.
Lots of discussion in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, so there actually aren't any more questions online, just a few comments. So just to pick out a couple of the comments. So Scott says, I cannot express in words how much your example beneficially impacts my and my family's life. It's very sweet.
Oh, that's so kind.
I'm very happy that these programs are helping people. But yeah, I don't see any other questions. Oh, wait, some more questions just appeared. Rainbow says, what is your thoughts on those who say meditation is, quote, doing nothing, unquote? My thought is that they're talking about anamitta samadhi, which in the Chinese tradition is called silent illumination. In the Japanese tradition, it's called shikantaza, or just sitting, which is, one way of saying it is that you are doing nothing. But it needs to be understood that this does not mean spacing out. It does not mean thinking about random things. It doesn't mean dozing off. It actually means a very profound state of attentive, precise knowing in which one is not generating any perceptions of objects or processes. So in that sense, you can say it's doing nothing, but one needs to understand that this is not doing nothing in the ordinary slacker kind of way, but it's actually an incredibly profound and refined state of mind that comes through practicing anamitta samadhi, objectless concentration. So Talmud says, I noticed on the Katina wish list that one of the items is general health visits with a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine. Are monastics permitted to visit other types of doctors?
Well, what do you mean by other types of doctors? Actually, traditional Chinese medicine, well, the traditional should give you a sort of hint. It's been around for a while. Kind of like traditional Buddhism, been around for a while. So other types, maybe you're asking other types of doctors that are not traditional?
Are things other than traditional Chinese medicine, maybe?
We can visit doctors, whether they're traditional or non-traditional, as long as it has to do with, the reason for the health of the body and not to do small talk and increase papancha or do waste time or do crazy stuff, then yeah, it's all good.
And Sumit says, as monks in the US, how do you manage your prerequisites like food, robes, accommodation, and medicine? Bante J.
People support us.
Okay, there's your answer.
Yeah, obviously, if we weren't supported, we couldn't be monastics. And if we were in a situation where there was no support, we'd have to go to a place where there's support.
Yeah, it's very simple.
Yeah,
so no different than in Asia.
Even myself as like a nomad monk, where I don't really have a permanent place right now, a lot of the support that I get is because of the causes and conditions of me being at a monastery and teaching there for years as well. Right? There's a momentum there that allows me to be kind of on my own and be supported. But if that momentum wasn't there, then I would have to really make sure that I had a place to stay, and that where I could actually be supported.
Yeah, we live on good karma. So we generate good karma through our practice, and that usually manifests in our basic needs being met one way or another. We also live extremely simple lives, so we don't need much.
Yeah. I always say I'm a cheap date.
A what?
Cheap date.
Cheap date. Oh.
Yeah.
You're really surprising me today.
Yes.
First you said that the solution to samadhi is kiss, and now you're saying you're a cheap date.
It's just normal. It's just what you call it, like pop culture sayings. That's all.
I gotcha. Yeah. And Sumit, it's probably Sumita. That's probably where the name is from. Sumita Dhammika. So the good friend in line with the Dhamma.
Very beautiful name.
Also asked, what is the connection between morality, sila, and concentration, samadhi, I assume?
Well, in brief, sila makes us happy and a happy mind gets easily concentrated. This is in brief. Long story short.
Yeah, also through practicing Sila, we become more aware of our impulses and habits, and we become more capable of controlling those impulses and habits. So it also then supports understanding the defilements of mind. It also supports controlling papancha, controlling excessive thinking. And Rahul says, in the suttas, stream entry mostly seems to come from listening to the Dhamma. Most folk today seem to think it's something achieved with a lot of meditation. What is your take? Both. So I would agree that stream entry is fundamentally a process of wisdom, and that without a thorough understanding of the Dhamma, it's very difficult to have the proper wisdom to attain stream entry. But at the same time, stream entry also involves a transformation of one's view, which is difficult to achieve without really working on the mind in an intensive way. So I would say it's both. People who just do a lot of meditation but don't cultivate wisdom through study and conversation, Dhamma talks and so on, I don't think their odds are that great. Without right view, you're not going to get far. But also, if you just read a bunch of books but never do any meditation, then similarly, odds are you're not going to get far. So then the suttas, the people who attain stream entry from hearing the Dhamma, it's usually people who are already meditation practitioners, and they just needed to get the right Dhamma knowledge in order to help them apply their mind in the correct way. Yeah, so it's both. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Rainbow asks, what is your favorite Jataka tale? Either one of you have a favorite Jataka tale?
Not the best for the Jatakas. They're not my favorite part of the canon. So.
I guess Gatikara, the
Gatikara,
potter.
the potter.
Yeah, and
yeah.
I'm trying to remember the Buddha's name in that.
Jotipala was his friend. That was a different story.
Gatikara is not the Buddha in that, though, because Gatikara comes to the Buddha later. I don't remember Gatikara.
Oh, like which was
friend.
The Buddha? Not...
Yeah, Gatikara was not the Buddha, because there's a sutta where Gatikara comes as a deva to visit Buddha. Yeah.
No, but then there was another story where there was a person named Jotipala.
Oh, okay.
But it wasn't Gatikara.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm also, I've never spent much time with the Jataka tales. I'm also not the best person to ask about the Jatakas.
I know that one because that's in the suttas.
Yeah. The ones which are in the suttas I tend to be more familiar with. The ones which are not in the suttas I usually don't know.
Okay.
And Rick said, what are your plans for the coming months? Will you be traveling?
Yes. Well, Bhante J can talk about his plans. We're a little bit more complicated than ours. Bhante Sudaso and I will be traveling with some other monastics to Italy, and we'll be doing some Tudong practice there again. And here at Empty Cloud, there will be Bhante Sumita and Aya Sulina coming. So you will see a lot of their teachings online during that time, and probably will appear from Italy here and there. We'll see if that works out.
And Rainbow says, I've heard you say that one should not try to invent their own Buddhism. But was Buddha not enlightened without having been taught Buddhism himself? Did his teachings originate from Hinduism? So the Buddha did attain an awakening without having been taught Buddhism. His teachings did not originate from Hinduism because Hinduism, as we know it, didn't really exist at the time. There were many different spiritual traditions at the time, which were the precursors of what we call Hinduism these days. But they're not quite like modern day Hinduism in many ways. So the Buddha was a Sammasambuddha, and he didn't invent anything either. The Buddha did not invent the Dhamma. The Buddha was actually very clear in many points in the suttas. He clearly states that he didn't invent the Dhamma, he just rediscovered it. So what we're doing then is we're trying to learn what the Dhamma is. So the Buddha had nobody to teach him, so he had to figure it out on his own. But it's like a scientist examining something. In theory, they're coming to the same conclusion any other scientist would come to. So in the same way, the Buddha examined the mind and discovered the Dhamma. And he was kind enough to describe it for the rest of us, to make it much, much easier for the rest of us to discover the Dhamma. Because we can follow his lab notes, which are pretty darn good. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, that's great. Like the Buddha's lab notes.
And we're running low on time. Let's see if there's some other questions here. Sumit says, could you name some valuable suttas to read in the Tripitaka? All of them. All of them. Read them all, cover to cover. Don't skip any. Read all of them. If you want me to name some specific ones, Sabasava Sutta, as Ayasama mentioned earlier, that's a great one. Samadhi Sutta, it's a great one. Just read all of them. Like, otherwise I'm just going to start like running through a list of the name of every sutta. Yeah, just read all of them. And that's, oh, wow.
Julie.
They keep popping up more questions. Julie says, was there ever an explanation as how the Buddha attained enlightenment? Like from a higher self or from a being in the spirit world? TJ?
It's
No.
a higher self.
Yeah, no, I don't know. This is so. Was there ever an explanation of how the Buddha obtained enlightenment? He investigated, he practiced, he tried, he followed, he tried all kinds of different practices, and then and even you could actually kind of see that all the practices that he tried, there was part of those practices that were some kind of right, but they were lacking something. Like, he even learned like the jhanas and things like that before he became awakened. But, it's like you could go into jhanas for 7 days and you come out of jhana and it's like, well, my dukkha is still there. So obviously this is not the way to the ending of suffering. And so the Buddha had to find that actual key that led to awakening. And that's what he did. So there was no nothing from higher self or a being in the spirit world or anything like that. Yeah, it was from his own investigation, his own practice.
Great. And that's the last question, and we're just about out of time. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.